Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Ryobi P3105 18-volt soldering iron. So let's get started. And starting off at the bottom of the tool, we have the 18-volt battery slot, which will accept any of Ryobi's 18-volt batteries. And as usual, the battery slot is nice and secure, and I have really no issues with the battery being too loose or falling out. Ryobi does a fairly good job with the battery slots, and I've never actually had a battery fall out, so this is a typical performance coming from Ryobi. And moving upward, we have the main body of the tool. Now, the main body of the tool is fairly easy to grab hold of for battery changes or just moving around, but at the same time, I really wish they would have put a rubberized coating similar to what they did with the 18-volt inverter. But I guess we didn't get that with this particular tool, but it is still fairly easy to grab onto, so it's not a huge negative. It's just something that would have been nice if they had included. Now, there is a mystery on the main body, and that's this little hatch near the front of the tool. Now, this little hatch, if you remove it with a screwdriver and tweezers, you'll find an electrical board that has, well, 6 contacts, and that's about it. The manual really doesn't explain what this is used for, and I don't really think Ryobi explains anywhere else what it's used for either. If you do know, please leave a comment explaining what it's used for, and that would be greatly appreciated. But it doesn't really affect the overall performance of the tool, at least as far as I know, so it's just going to have to remain a mystery for now. Moving to the top of the soldering iron, we have the on and off switch. The on and off switch is a very simple switch. You press it once to turn it on, and then you press it again to turn it off. So overall, it's a very simple switch. And above the on and off button, we have the LED indicator light. The LED indicator is inactive when you first put the battery in, but once you power on the unit, it'll begin flashing rapidly, signaling that it's warming up. Once the unit has warmed up and is at full power, then the LED indicator light will turn red and stay a constant red, and once you turn the unit off, then it will slowly flash until the unit has become cool. Now, the warm-up time for this particular soldering iron is right around a minute, and the cool down time, well, that is really based on how warm of an environment you're working in. I was working in an environment that was right around freezing, and it took it about 10 minutes or so for it to fully cool down and for the LED light to stop flashing. If you're working in a warmer environment or a hot environment, it's going to take the soldering iron considerably longer to cool down, so just be aware of that. The user manual states that you should wait about 30 minutes before storing, and I'd say that's probably a fairly safe bet, but you should always check before you actually store the tool somewhere where it might cause a fire. Moving on, above the LED indicator light, we have the cheat sheet for what the LED indicator light means. This is especially handy if it's early in the morning and you've just woken up and you're not fully awake yet. An alternative to using this cheat sheet would be to stab yourself in the leg with the soldering iron, and that should hopefully provide you with a little bit more motivation to wake up. Of course, that was a joke. I don't actually recommend you doing that ever. That was a joke. Moving back down the tool, we have the power cord, which powers the soldering pin. Now, overall, this power cord is made out of a fairly flexible material, which is fairly strong. I actually think it's a very well-designed cord. It doesn't feel overly stiff, where it would make working on something difficult, and it doesn't feel flimsy either. So overall, I think it's just about as good as it can get. I will say the one area I would change on this particular power cord would be to make it removable. As it stands right now, it is not removable, and so if something were to damage it, well, you'd be out of luck and you'd probably have to end up buying a new tool. So overall, that would be the one area that I would probably change, but it's still a good cord and it still does a good job. Oh, and the usable length of the cord is about 2.5 feet, and the length of the cord is about 2 feet 8 inches, and if you were to measure to the very tip of the soldering iron, your length is looking at around 42 inches. So overall, it has a fairly good reach. Okay, moving on to the opposite side of the body, we have the soldering pin holder. Now overall, the holder does a good job of holding the soldering pin and keeping the tip of the soldering pin suspended in the air, as long as the pin has been fully inserted. Now in the video, it looks like that the tip might be resting against the top, but it isn't. It actually is being fully suspended in the air, and this will definitely help prevent heat transfer from going into the holder and then eventually making its way down near the battery. Overall, I've tested the area near the base of the holder, and it seems to remain fairly cool. So overall, I really don't have any safety concerns, at least not in that regard. I will say the one area of the pin or holder I would change would be to add a locking feature for when you insert the pin. As it stands right now, the pin just sits in there, and it really is, well, it can be a little bit tricky if you're transporting it and you're not being careful. As long as you're being careful, you're not going to have any issues, but it still would be very handy to have a locking feature where you could twist the pin to one direction or the other and have it lock in place. So maybe in a future model we'll get that feature, but as it stands on this particular model, we still don't have that feature. So that's just something else to be aware of. But overall, the holder does a good job, and I don't see any issues with it. Okay, moving on to the soldering pin itself. Now, the soldering pin itself has a nice rubberized grip, and it does a good job of, well, keeping your hand right where it needs to stay, and in turn keeping the tip of the soldering iron right where it needs to be. On some of my older soldering irons, they have an all plastic, hard plastic, you know, handle, and it just is not that comfortable to hold, and if you're working for long periods of time, your hands will become sweaty and they'll be hard to grip onto the soldering iron. So overall, I really actually like this rubberized texture on this particular soldering iron, and I personally am never going to go back to using a regular soldering iron after using it. I really do like the grip on this particular soldering iron, and it is definitely a pro feature in my opinion. Okay, moving on from the grip to the tip. Now the tip of this particular soldering iron is a fine pointed tip, and this will do a good job for when you are working with electronics or with jewelry. If you are wanting a different style of tip, the tip is replaceable, and the style of tip is a sleeve style, which means it will go over the heating element. And you can find replacements from Home Depot that Ryobi offers, although I wouldn't actually buy those simply because the prices they're asking for are more in line with Hilti prices rather than Ryobi prices. I personally would go over to Amazon and look around on there and try to find a sleeve style that would be compatible with this particular soldering iron, which is something I probably will do in the future. But at the moment, the only tip I currently have is the one that was included, and it did a good job on several repair projects I've had so far. So I have repaired a headlamp, and I've also repaired a video light that needed a battery replacement. So overall, I've had good luck using the tip that was included, and I don't really see the need for changing it at the moment. So overall, I have to say the include tip does do a good job, and it is easily replaceable, and you don't need tools in order to replace it. I would recommend only replacing the tip after the soldering iron has cooled down. Replacing it when the soldering iron is hot is not advisable unless you enjoy third-degree burns or you're the Human Torch. So in summary, the tip that is included is good for general electronics and, well, jewelry. So, moving on. Okay, moving on to weight. Without a battery, the tool weighs 349 grams, or a little under 0.8 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour battery, the tool weighs 1,030 grams, or a little over 2.2 pounds. Okay, let's go over the pros and cons real quick. 18 volts. 18 volts means that you'll be able to use the same batteries that you use in your drill in order to power the soldering iron, and that'll come in handy for when you're working out in that shed that doesn't have that AC outlet, or out in the middle of the field underneath a trailer on the brake system. So quite frankly, this is a pro. Self-standing. This unit is self-standing thanks to the battery that's plugged in underneath it, and the bigger the battery, the more stable it's going to be. So quite frankly, I would definitely consider this to be a pro. Built-in holder. Overall, the built-in holder does a good job and definitely means that it's going to be much easier to transport this places because you won't have to worry about multiple components. So overall, I would definitely consider this to be a pro. Cord length. Overall, the length of the cord is about 2 feet 8 inches, and this will definitely give you plenty of reach for most jobs or situations, so definitely a pro. LED indicator. Overall, the LED indicator does a good job of telling you when the unit is warming up, cooling down, or just staying on. So overall, the LED indicator does do a good job. Just remember that if you unplug the battery, the LED indicator will not function, so you won't know if it's cooling down, unless you use common sense. Easy tip change. The fact that you don't need any tools in order to change the tip is a super nice and convenient feature, and definitely a pro feature in my opinion. And the first meh would be no LED work light. Overall, having a little built-in LED work light would have been very handy and definitely a nice feature to have, but we didn't get it, so it's kind of a meh. And the first con would be no settings. There's no way to adjust the temperature up or down. You're stuck at one temperature setting. And while this works for the majority of people, certain people want different settings that they can choose from. And their only option would be to step up to the more expensive model that Ryobi offers. So this is the con in my opinion. And the next con would be pin doesn't lock and holder. Overall, this would be a very super useful design and it would definitely help with the overall safety of the tool. But in the long run, it really isn't that big of a deal as long as you're careful. No tip cleaner. Overall, not having a tip cleaner definitely limits you in certain situations, and it definitely would have been a nice feature to include, and it's something they could have done if they had really wanted to. And the last con would be that the cord is not removable. Now, there's nothing wrong with the cord, and I think it's a good cord and it does a good job. I just personally would have preferred to have a removable cord in case something were to happen to it, that I could replace it and still use the tool. This would have been good for a variety of reasons, and the fact that we didn't get this option is definitely a disappointment in my opinion. And that's it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular soldering iron. Overall, this soldering iron has done a good job on different projects around the house, and I really have had zero complaints about it. I've used it to repair a headlamp as well as a video light, and both projects turned out successful, and I've been very happy with just the overall performance coming from the tool. It does a good job of keeping the soldering element hot, and it will melt through the solder fairly quickly. So I've been very, very pleased in that regard. I think pros or professionals will probably be better off with an alternative tool because this one just won't offer the amount of features that a pro will need, but for the average homeowner, DIYer, or hobbyist, this will definitely have more than enough power and more than enough capability, and it would definitely be something on my wish list if I didn't already buy it. So this tool comes comes highly recommended to anybody who currently is looking for a soldering iron that has Ryobi batteries or doesn't mind buying Ryobi batteries to power a soldering iron. So this power tool comes highly recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.